The morning I decided I was done, I was sitting alone at a small table in a quiet coffee shop near the base, staring at a cup of black coffee that had already gone cold. I wasn't reading. I wasn't on my phone. I was just sitting there, running the same sentence through my head on a loop, the way you run your tongue over a broken tooth. Not because it feels good, but because you can't stop. I'll try harder. That was it. That was my whole plan. 3 words that I had been telling myself for 2 years, and 3 words that had gotten me absolutely nowhere. 3 words that I had repeated so many times they had lost all meaning, hollowed out from the inside like a word you say over and over until it stops sounding like a word at all and becomes just a sound. A sound that I was making at myself in the silence of my own head in a coffee shop near a military base at 7 a.m. on a Saturday, while my life came apart with the quiet patience of something that had been loosening for a very long time. If this is already hitting something you recognize, that feeling of gripping harder and getting less, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what comes next. Every story on this channel is about someone who found a way through and the lessons they carried out the other side. Hit the bell, leave a comment with where you are right now, and let's keep going. My name is Elena Ortega. At the time of this story, I was 35 years old and a major in the United States Army. On paper, my life looked like something worth being proud of. 12 years of service, 2 deployments overseas, a record that my commanding officer had called, and I'm quoting him directly here, one of the most disciplined files I've seen come through this office. I had a son. I had a career that most people in uniform spend a decade trying to build. And I was sitting in that coffee shop on a Saturday morning, feeling like the most spectacular failure I had ever personally met. Because here is what the file didn't say. It didn't say that my husband had asked for a divorce by letter while I was 7,000 miles away in the middle of my second deployment. It didn't say that my son, who was 8 years old, had stopped running to me when I came home. That he looked at me now with this careful, measuring expression, like I was someone he was still deciding whether or not he could trust. It didn't say that 6 weeks after returning stateside, I had received a performance evaluation that used the word inconsistent 3 times in 2 paragraphs. 3 times. For a woman who had built her entire identity around being anything but. What the file also didn't say. What I hadn't told anyone. Not my battalion commander. Not the chaplain. Not the Army counselor I had seen exactly twice before, telling myself I didn't have time, was that I was exhausted in a way that sleep couldn't fix. I was running on something that I had always called willpower. Pure, white-knuckled, teeth-clenched willpower. Every morning I woke up and I forced myself through the day. I forced myself to work out. I forced myself to be patient with my son. I forced myself to be present in briefings when my mind kept drifting to the divorce papers sitting on the kitchen counter. I forced and forced and forced. And every single night I fell into bed feeling like I had failed at every single thing I had tried to force. And the only answer I had ever given myself was the same answer. Try harder. More willpower. Push through. It was the same answer that had served me through officer candidate school, through my first deployment, through every performance evaluation and physical fitness test and leadership challenge that 12 years had put in front of me. Push through. Grip harder. Find more. The Army had rewarded that answer for over a decade, and so I had never once questioned whether it was actually the right answer or simply the only one I knew. but it wasn't working anymore. And I didn't know why, and not knowing why was in some ways worse than the failure itself. That Saturday morning, I had woken up at 5, which was not unusual. What was unusual was that I had sat on the edge of my bed for 45 minutes without moving, which had never happened to me in my adult life. I was always in motion. Motion was how I survived, but that morning, the motion just wasn't there, and I sat in the dark of my bedroom in a house that was too quiet because my son was at his father's for the weekend, and I thought about my evaluation. I thought about the word inconsistent. I thought about the look on my son's face. I thought about the letter my husband had written, the specific paragraph where he said he wasn't angry. He was just tired of being married to someone who treated their own life like a mission to push through, someone who was always performing and never present. I had read that paragraph so many times that I had it memorized, not because I meant to memorize it, but because it had embedded itself in me the way certain things do when they are true and painful in equal measure. He hadn't been wrong. That was the part I had never said out loud to anyone. My husband had not been wrong. Eventually, I got dressed. I drove to a coffee shop near the base because I could not stand to be inside that house for one more minute. I ordered black coffee because I didn't have the bandwidth to make a decision about anything else. And I sat down at a small table by the window, and I started doing what I had been doing for months, talking to myself in a low, tight voice, running through everything that was wrong and landing on the same conclusion every single time. I just need to try harder. I need more willpower. If I can just push through this stretch, everything will stabilize. I didn't realize I was saying some of it out loud until I heard a quiet laugh from the table beside me. I looked up. There was a man sitting about 4 feet away from me, a large coffee in front of him, a battered paperback book face down on the table. He was older. I would have guessed early 60s, though something about him made age feel like an irrelevant detail. He wasn't a big man, medium height, lean in the way that suggested a lifetime of functional movement rather than gym aesthetics. His hair was silver and cut close. His hands around the coffee cup were weathered in a way that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with work. He was wearing plain clothes. Nothing about him announced anything. He looked like someone's grandfather. He looked like someone you would pass on the street without a second thought. He was looking at me with an expression that was not unkind. And he had just laughed. "I'm sorry," I said, and I was not in the mood to be apologetic about it. "Don't be," he said. His voice was calm, unhurried, the voice of a man who had learned a long time ago that urgency was a choice. "You said willpower, and then you said you need to try harder." He paused. "I've heard that before." "Good for you," I said. He smiled, and it was a real smile, not a patronizing one. "Where are you stationed?" he asked. I hesitated. 12 years in the Army had given me a finely calibrated sense for who was military and who wasn't, who had seen real things, and who was performing. Something about this man's stillness, the way he sat, the specific quality of his attention, told me that this was not a civilian who had wandered in off the street. "Base," I said, which was not an answer, and we both knew it. He nodded, as if that told him everything he needed. "How long have you been white-knuckling it?" he asked. I stared at him. "Excuse me?" "Willpower," he said. "How long have you been treating it like it's unlimited? Like if you just clench hard enough, everything stays together?" Something about the question hit me in a place I hadn't been expecting, and I felt the sudden, humiliating pressure of tears behind my eyes, which I shut down immediately. 2 years, approximately. I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that I have thought about almost every day since. He said, "Willpower is the reason you're failing." I looked at him. "That doesn't make any sense," I said. "No," he agreed. "It doesn't. Not yet." He picked up his coffee. "You bought me something to drink a few minutes ago without my asking," he said, "when I was having trouble with the line." I had done that. When I had come in, I had seen this man standing at the counter, his cane hooked over his forearm, struggling quietly to manage his wallet and the tray at the same time. I had stepped in without thinking about it. It hadn't felt like a decision. "You look like you could use a hand," I said. "I could," he said simply. "That's a specific kind of person. Someone who helps without waiting to be asked." He looked at me steadily. "I don't give advice to many people, but I'd like to show you something, if you're willing to listen." His name, he told me then, was Raymond Cole. He told me he was retired. He did not tell me anything else, and something in his manner made it clear that further questions were not invited. He asked for my number and said he would call in a few days. I almost said no. I almost told him I didn't have time, which would have been a lie dressed up as scheduling. But I looked at him, at the stillness, the absolute absence of performance, and I gave him my number. What I didn't know then, what I would not discover for 3 months, was who Raymond Cole actually was. The man who had just told me that willpower was my problem had spent 26 years in the United States Army, 16 of them as an operator in the one unit that does not officially exist, the one that soldiers lower their voices to name. He had run operations in 11 countries. He had served as an instructor for the most grueling selection process in the American Special Operations community, a process that washes out somewhere between 80 and 90% of the candidates who attempt it. He had 2 silver stars and a Distinguished Service Cross, and those were only the decorations that could be mentioned in public. The scar on his right knee, which was why he had the cane, was from an incident in a country whose name had never appeared in any report that would ever be declassified. He had spent his entire career learning the science and the art of performing at an elite level under conditions that would dismantle most human beings. And at some point in that career, he had discovered something that almost nobody outside of a very specific world understood about the nature of discipline. Not willpower. Discipline. I didn't know any of that. I was just a burned-out major with cold coffee and a failing performance review, and I had just agreed to listen to a quiet old man with a cane. He called 3 days later on a Tuesday morning, before the sun was fully up. "Meet me tomorrow," he said. "There's a track near the north end of a park about 2 miles from the coffee shop. 6 in the morning. "I have PT with my unit at 06:30, I said. "I know," he said. "Be there at 6. And he hung up. I almost didn't go. I ran through every reason not to. The awkwardness of it, the time, the fact that I didn't know this man, the faint professional instinct that said senior officers don't take fitness advice from strangers in coffee shops. And then I remembered the word inconsistent, appearing in my evaluation 3 times. I set my alarm for 5. When I arrived at the track, he was already there. He was standing still near the first bend, hands in his jacket pockets, watching the early light come over the tree line. He didn't look up when I approached, but he spoke. "Tell me your morning routine," he said. I told him. I woke up at 5. I ran. I showered. I made breakfast for my son on the days he was with me. I got to the office. I worked. I came home. I tried to be present. I failed at being present. I went to bed. I repeated. He listened without interrupting. Then he said, And what does your routine look like on the days when you don't feel like it? I thought about it. About the same, I said. I pushed through. And how much energy does that cost you? The pushing? I opened my mouth and then closed it, because I had never been asked that question, and I had no practiced answer for it. A lot, I finally said. He nodded slowly. That's the tax, he said. Every time you have to fight yourself to do the thing you already decided to do, you pay a tax. Decision fatigue, emotional drain. Willpower is a resource and you're treating it like it's infinite. It's not. It runs out. And when it runs out, he looked at me. What happens? I drop things, I said quietly. I'm inconsistent. You're inconsistent, he repeated. That's the word, isn't it? That's what they put in the file. He was watching me carefully. What if I told you that the operators I worked with, the ones who lasted, who performed decade after decade under conditions you and I both know are not compatible with being human, almost none of them relied on willpower? I looked at him. That's not possible, I said. That's exactly what that environment requires. No, he said, and his voice had the particular quiet certainty of someone who is not arguing, just correcting. That's what people think it requires. That's the civilian understanding of elite performance. Push harder. Dig deeper. More willpower. More grit. Clench your teeth and survive. He shook his head once, small and precise. The ones who last don't push against themselves every morning. They don't have to, because they build systems. Not willpower, systems. He started walking along the track, slowly, with the slight favoring of his right side that the cane usually compensated for, and I fell into step beside him. Willpower is a feeling, he said. It's an emotional state that you generate in the moment to override another emotional state. It is useful in the short term under extreme duress. In a firefight, in a moment of genuine crisis. That is what willpower is for. He glanced at me. It is not designed to manage a morning routine. It is not designed to hold a career together across 2 years of personal collapse. When you use it for that, when you use a crisis tool to manage normal life, you burn it down to the ground. And then you have nothing left for the actual crises. We walked in silence for a moment. Around us, the park was just beginning to fill with morning. A few other runners, a dog pulling at a leash, the sound of traffic somewhere beyond the trees. So what do they do instead? I asked. They decide in advance, he said. They take the decision off the table. They don't ask themselves every morning whether they feel like running. The run is already decided. It's not a question. It's not a negotiation. It's a system. It happens whether they feel good or feel terrible, whether they're motivated or empty, whether the night before was smooth or it destroyed them. They build the structure, and then they live inside the structure. And the structure does the work that willpower was never designed to do. He stopped walking and turned to face me. You've been white-knuckling your life, he said. Gripping every piece of it and forcing it to hold. I'm telling you that your grip is what's making everything slip. I stood there on that track in the early morning light and felt something move in my chest that I had been keeping very still for a very long time. Give me 3 months, he said. I'll show you how to stop fighting yourself. The first formal meeting felt nothing like what I had imagined. I had constructed some version of it in my head during the drive over. A serious conversation, perhaps a kind of intake interview, a structured laying out of the plan. What actually happened was that we walked in silence for about 8 minutes, And then Raymond stopped and asked me to stand still and look at the tree line. I looked at the tree line. "What do you see?" he said. I described what I saw. Trees, morning light, a bird on a high branch, the movement of leaves in a wind I couldn't quite feel from where I was standing. "How do you feel right now?" he said. I thought about it honestly. "Calmer than I've been in weeks," I said. He nodded once. "That's what stillness does," he said. "You've been in motion for 2 years. Constant motion, constantly managing, constantly forcing. Your nervous system is running a sustained emergency protocol that was designed for short bursts. You're not burned out because you're weak. You're burned out because you've been asking your body to sustain a crisis state indefinitely." He looked at the trees. Stillness is not inactivity. It is a discipline. The best operators I ever worked with understood the value of it. They could be absolutely still in the middle of chaos because they had trained stillness the same way they trained everything else, deliberately, with intention, as a skill. He told me that the first weeks were not going to look like what I expected training to look like, that there would be no dramatic program, no physical regimen designed to break me down and rebuild me. What he was going to do was show me how to see the structure of my own behavior clearly enough to change it. And that required, first, a quality of attention I had been running too hard to develop. You cannot fix what you cannot see clearly, he said, and you cannot see clearly when you're moving too fast to look. He paused. "Slow down. Look, that's the first thing." I almost argued with him. 12 years of military culture had given me a very specific relationship to productivity and visible effort, and standing at a tree line, looking at birds, did not register as either. But I had also been managing my own productivity with enormous discipline for 2 years, and I was sitting in a coffee shop talking to myself. So I stood there and looked at the trees and said nothing. That evening, I drove home, in a quiet I hadn't felt in a very long time. Over the course of the weeks that followed, Raymond Cole taught me things that I had never heard articulated in 12 years of military service, in 2 deployments and leadership courses and command schools and after-action reviews. He never gave me a manual. He never handed me a reading list. He taught the way I would later learn the best operators always teach, by creating situations that forced understanding and then naming what I had just experienced. The first real lesson came in the second week. I had shown up to the track on a Wednesday morning after a night that had gone sideways in multiple directions at once. My son had called from his father's place, upset about something that I couldn't fully understand through the crying, and the call had ended badly. Not a fight, but that particular kind of distance that is worse than a fight. The kind where you can feel the gap between you and someone you love getting wider in real time. I had barely slept. I had dragged myself to the track because the alternative was lying in a dark room, thinking, and I had arrived feeling exactly like what I was. A person who was running entirely on the fumes of a decision made the night before. Raymond was already there. He looked at me once and said nothing. We started walking, and after about 3 minutes, he said, "Rate your motivation right now. 1 to 10. 2, I said. He nodded. "And are you here?" "Yes." "Why?" I thought about it honestly, because I had learned quickly that Raymond Cole had a very low tolerance for answers that were performed rather than true. "Because yesterday I decided I would be," I said. He looked at me, and for the first time since I'd met him, he looked genuinely pleased. "That's it," he said. "Right there. Do you hear what you just said?" I replayed it. I was here because of a decision I made yesterday, not because of how I felt this morning. Motivation is a weather system, he said. It moves in, it moves out. It's warm, it's cold. It bears no relationship to what you need to do. You have no more control over your motivation than you have over whether it rains. He stopped walking. The operators I worked with, the ones who were still performing at the highest level after 20 years, almost none of them were highly motivated people in the way civilians imagine. They were not waking up every morning electrified, ready to take on the world. Many of them were exhausted. Many of them were dealing with things at home that would break most people. Many of them had been doing the same hard things for so long that the excitement had burned off completely. He resumed walking. But they showed up every time because they had made a decision that was separate from their emotional state. The decision was not subject to renegotiation based on how they felt. It was a system. And the system ran whether the weather was good or the weather was terrible. He let that sit for a moment, and I listened to the sound of our footsteps on the track, the particular rhythm of someone walking with a slight impairment and someone walking in step with them. And somehow, in that rhythm, I heard what he was saying in a way that went below the level of language. Motivation gets you to sign up, he said. Discipline gets you to show up. For 20 years, that's the difference. And discipline is not a feeling. It is a structure. You build the structure when you're strong, and then the structure carries you when you're not. I thought about my marriage. I thought about the years when my husband had been asking for more of me, and I had kept saying I would try harder. I had been waiting to feel differently, to feel more present, more available, less like I was managing a deployment even when I was home. I had been waiting for motivation to make me a better partner. I had been waiting for a feeling that never came consistently enough to be reliable. I've been waiting to feel ready, I said. Everyone does, he said. Almost nobody gets there, because ready is a feeling and feelings don't run on a schedule. He looked at me. You want to be present for your son? The directness of it caught me. Yes, I said. Then decide to be present, not when you feel it, not when the deployment hangover clears and you feel like yourself again. Decide now, in advance, what being present looks like, what time you are home, what you do when you walk in that door, what the structure is, and then run the structure, not because you feel like a good mother, because you decided to be one. I had to stop walking for a moment. Something about the bluntness of that sentence, not cruel, not dismissive, just absolutely direct, landed somewhere very deep. I had been waiting to feel like a good mother. I had been waiting to feel it. And in the meantime, I was absent because I didn't know how to be present without the feeling leading the way. The feeling follows the action, Raymond said quietly, as if he could read what was moving through me. Not the other way around. Every operator learns this eventually. You act consistently, and the emotion catches up. You don't wait for the emotion to authorize the action. He told me then about a man he had served with, which he did rarely and without specific names. Just the shape of a person, the outline of what they had done and learned. This man had come into the unit at 30, already a seasoned soldier, already decorated. And he had nearly washed out of selection not because of physical failure, but because of something subtler. Every time the training became particularly grinding, particularly repetitive, this man would start searching for reasons it was worth continuing. He needed the motivation to be available. He needed to feel the purpose in order to access the performance. and selection, the process that tested whether a person could operate at elite levels, had a particular genius for removing every external source of motivation and leaving you alone with the raw question of whether you had built anything underneath it. The man had almost quit on day 19 of a process that lasted 3 weeks. He didn't quit. He finished. And Raymond had asked him afterward, years later, what had changed on day 19. He told me he stopped trying to find a reason to keep going, Raymond said. He said he realized that looking for the reason was the problem. Because every time he went looking, he was giving himself permission to stop if he didn't find one good enough. So he stopped looking. He decided that the question was not on the table anymore. The question of whether to continue was simply closed. And once the question was closed, he said it was almost peaceful. He didn't have to fight himself anymore. The fight had been about whether to continue, and once he removed that fight, all he had to do was move forward. We walked in silence for a while after that, and I let the weight of what he had described settle into the particular part of me that needed to hear it most. That's what discipline is, Raymond said eventually. Not grinding, not forcing, removing the negotiation, building a structure so solid that the question of whether to follow it simply doesn't arise. He glanced at me. You've been negotiating with yourself every morning. Do I feel like this? Is today the day I take a break? Can I push through? That negotiation costs more than the activity itself. Stop negotiating. The second lesson came about 2 weeks later, and it arrived not as a conversation, but as a sharp, precise observation that Raymond made one morning with the particular economy of a man who had spent decades saying only what needed to be said. I had been working on building systems, actual physical structures for my days. I had written out what my mornings looked like without consulting my feelings about it. Wake up at 5, clothes laid out the night before, coffee started before the alarm, a specific block of time before work that was not negotiable. I had been doing it for about 10 days, and something had shifted quietly in the quality of my days, not dramatically. Nothing about my life had changed externally, but I noticed that I was arriving at my office with slightly more in the tank than before. Slightly less of myself had been spent before the day even started. But I was still struggling with the evenings, the transitions between work and home. The moments when I came through the door carrying everything from the day, and my son needed something from me that I wasn't sure I had. Raymond listened and then said, "What does your environment look like when you walk in?" I described it. My house. The layout of the main room. Where things were. Is your son's homework set up when you arrive? Usually not, I said. He usually has the television on. So you walk in already depleted, Raymond said, and the first thing that happens is friction. The structure of the environment is working against the behavior you want. He paused. Most people think discipline is internal. Something you generate from the inside, something you summon. He shook his head slightly. Experienced operators understand that your environment is either building your discipline for you or destroying it. Set the environment for the behavior you want before you need the behavior. Don't rely on willpower in the moment. Remove the moment where willpower would be required. He explained it through the lens of something I understood immediately, which was mission planning. In an operational context, you don't arrive at the objective and then decide how to navigate it. You've been through it in your head hundreds of times. You've wargamed the friction points. You've positioned resources in advance. The performance in the field is downstream of the preparation in the rear. Elite units didn't perform well under pressure because they were tougher than everyone else in the moment. They performed well because they had eliminated as many variables as possible before the moment arrived, so that when they were in it, they had one job: execute. Your home is an operational environment, Raymond said, and I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so exactly right. You walk in tired. Your son is a person with needs. You have competing pulls on your attention. That is a complex environment, and you've been walking into it with no preparation and expecting willpower to handle all of it in real time. He looked at me. What if the homework was already set up? What if you had a 10-minute transition structure, something specific you do when you walk in the door that signals the shift for both of you? What if the environment was preloaded for the interaction you want instead of the interaction you fall into? I went home that day, and I changed the layout of the room my son used for homework. I called his school and arranged for the homework schedule to come to me directly so I could look at it in the morning. I started leaving a note for him on the counter. Small things, nothing elaborate, just a note that told him I was thinking about him during the day. And I built a small, specific structure for the first 15 minutes after I came home, which required nothing of my willpower, because it was already decided, and it was simple enough that exhaustion couldn't dismantle it. Within a week, something changed with my son. Not everything, not the deep, accumulated distance that 2 years of my absence had created. But something in the temperature of those evenings shifted, slightly and unmistakably. And I understood for the first time that the presence I had been waiting to feel my way into was something I could build my way into instead. The third major lesson came during a week when the operational tempo at work had increased and my scheduling had compressed in ways that threatened to collapse the systems I had been building. I was behind on 2 reports and managing a personnel issue inside my unit that required a level of interpersonal attention I was struggling to generate. I had missed my morning structure twice in 4 days because of early briefings that I hadn't accounted for properly. By Thursday, I was feeling something uncomfortably familiar. The beginning of the white-knuckle grip coming back, the sense that everything was being held together by force rather than structure. When I told Raymond about it that Saturday, he was quiet for a long moment. "What failed?" he said. "The schedule," I said. The briefings weren't in my calendar early enough, and they cut into the mornings. "So the system had a gap," he said, "a place where an external variable could break it?" "Yes." "Good," he said, and I looked at him. "Every system has gaps when you first build it. The operational value is not in building a perfect system on the first attempt. It's in identifying where it breaks and closing the gap." He looked at me steadily. "What's the fix?" I thought about it. Build the morning structure to accommodate an early briefing. Have a shortened version that works when there's less time, so the variable doesn't break the system. The system adapts around the variable. He nodded. "A plan that can't survive contact with reality is not a plan," he said. "It's a wish." He said it without judgment, just as a fact. The operators I worked with rebuilt their systems constantly, not because they failed, because the environment kept changing and the system had to change with it. That is not instability. That is adaptation. And adaptation is a skill. You learn to look at where the system broke and ask a single question. What do I need to add or change so it doesn't break there again? That's it. No self-judgment. No narrative about failure. Just a technical adjustment. He said something then that I wrote down that evening and have kept since. "Stop telling yourself the story of how you failed," he said. "You are not a story. You are a system. When the system breaks, you fix the system. You don't mourn the break. You close the gap and move forward. I had been telling myself a story about failure for 2 years. A rich, detailed, emotionally exhausting story in which I was a woman who couldn't hold her life together despite her best efforts. I had been living inside that narrative the way you live inside a room with no windows. It was just the space I existed in, and I had stopped noticing what it was doing to the light. The idea that I was not a story, that I was a system that needed adjustment, rather than a person who kept failing, was so structurally different from anything I had told myself that it took several days to settle in completely. But it settled. The fourth thing Raymond gave me was not a lesson exactly. It arrived about 6 weeks into the mentorship, when I had been describing a pattern I noticed in myself, that my systems held consistently in the mornings and fell apart more often in the afternoons and evenings, particularly on high-stress days at work. Raymond listened and then asked me something that I was not prepared for. "Are you building systems for who you are right now?" he said, "or for who you think you should be?" I stopped walking. "Explain," I said. "You're building your morning structure around a 5 o'clock wake-up," he said. "Because that's what a disciplined officer does. That's the standard you've held yourself to for 12 years. Is that who you actually are right now, in this period of your life? Or is that a performance standard you haven't yet renegotiated?" I sat with that for a moment. "My son is with me every other week," I said slowly. "The weeks he's with me, 5 is the right time. The weeks he's not, 5 is..." I paused. "5 is a habit dressed up as discipline." "Exactly," he said. "Discipline is not about holding yourself to the hardest possible standard, because the hardest possible standard represents your best self. Discipline is about consistency between your values and your behavior. If your value is being present for your son, the system should serve that. If your value is operational performance, the system should serve that. The system is a tool. It's not the point. You are not building discipline to prove something. You are building it to live well." He paused, and then said something that I believe is one of the most quietly radical things I have ever heard about the nature of personal performance. "The units that train the hardest without purpose," he said, "burned out the fastest. I watched it happen. Teams that were all discipline and no direction. They were excellent at the mechanical execution and had no idea what they were executing for. Eventually, the structure becomes a prison. You stop moving toward something and start just enduring. And endurance without direction is just suffering." He looked at me. "What are you enduring for? Why do you want this? Not the performance, not the evaluation, not the promotion. Why?" I thought about my son's face. I thought about the look he'd had when I first came home from deployment. Not joy, not relief, just that careful measuring expression. I thought about how I wanted to earn back the look he used to have when he was younger, before I left the second time, before the distance had accumulated to the point where even when I was in the room, I wasn't entirely present in it. "My son," I said. "Then every system you build should serve that," Raymond said, "not because it makes you feel like a better person, not because it looks like discipline from the outside, because it moves you toward him." He looked at me with that steady, weathered attention that I had come to understand was not something you performed. It was something you earned through decades of actually paying attention to things that mattered. Discipline in the absence of direction is punishment. Discipline in service of something real is power. There was a fifth thing, smaller but no less permanent, that came in our second-to-last meeting. I had been talking about how I still caught myself on certain days, waiting for the feeling before taking action. The old reflex of wanting to feel ready, feel motivated, feel like the person I was trying to be before actually being her. And Raymond said this. Identity, he said. That's the last piece. You're still acting from the outside in. You're performing the behaviors in the hope of eventually feeling like someone who performs them naturally. Flip it. Decide who you are, not what you do. I am someone who shows up for her son. I am someone whose word to herself is binding. Not I am trying to become. I am. He let a moment pass. The operators who were most resilient under the most sustained pressure were not the ones who were the most motivated or the most talented. They were the ones for whom these behaviors were not performances. They were expressions. They were not trying to be disciplined. They were someone for whom discipline was simply how they moved through the world. That's not a feeling you wait for. That's a decision you make, and then you live inside until it becomes true. I thought about that for the rest of the day, and then for many days after. I had been performing the identity I wanted. Raymond was telling me to inhabit it. The distinction sounded subtle and was entirely seismic. 3 months went by in a way that was both faster and slower than I expected. Faster because I was building things, which always compresses time, and slower because real change, the kind that goes below the surface layer of behavior and gets into the structure of how you think about yourself, is slow and quiet and often invisible until one day it isn't. The changes in my work performance were noticed before I noticed them myself. My commanding officer called me in about 8 weeks into the mentorship and mentioned that he was seeing a different quality of consistency in my performance. He used the word consistent. I had to work to keep my expression neutral. With my son, the change was slower, which I had expected, and which Raymond had told me to expect. You didn't become distant overnight, he said, when I raised it about 2 months in. You're not going to rebuild it overnight either. Keep running the system. Be there. Over and over. The trust isn't rebuilt in a single conversation. It's rebuilt in the accumulated weight of you showing up, again and again, and leaving him no reason to doubt that you will. I kept running the system. I kept showing up. There were days when I didn't feel the progress. Days when the gap between my son and me still felt too wide to close, and the systems felt mechanical and hollow, like going through motions in the dark. On those days, I thought of what Raymond had said about the operators who lasted. Not that they always felt the purpose, but that they had removed the question of whether to continue. The question was not on the table. The only available action was forward, and forward, one day at a time, in the absence of any feeling that justified it, turned out to be enough. If you're still with this story, you probably know exactly what I'm talking about. Drop a comment below. Just tell us one thing you've been white-knuckling. And if this channel has given you something useful, a like goes a long way toward making sure more people find these stories when they need them. Now, let's get back to Elena. And then, near the end of the 3rd month, Raymond arrived at the track one morning, carrying a small wooden box. He set it on the bench near the start of the track, and we walked our usual circuit first, and he was quieter than usual, and I had the feeling that something was closing. When we came back around to the bench, he stopped and looked at it for a moment. I want to tell you something, he said. All right, I said. The reason I talked to you in that coffee shop was not because of what you were saying, he said. It was because of what you did before that. The way you stepped in at the counter. You didn't ask if I needed help. You didn't wait to see if I was managing. You just saw what was needed, and you did it. That's rare." He paused. I've had a policy for most of my life about not giving unsolicited advice, because most people who need advice don't actually want change. They want validation. But I made an exception for you, because what I saw in that moment was not someone who was broken. It was someone who knew how to act correctly under pressure and had just temporarily forgotten how to apply it to herself. He picked up the box and held it out to me. "Don't open it yet," he said. "Wait until you feel like yourself again. You'll know when." I took it. He looked at me for a moment with the specific, quiet attention that I had come to understand was his way of communicating things that he didn't translate into words. "The operators I worked with," he said, "the ones who lasted, they all reached a point where they stopped being sustained by external pressure and started being sustained by the structure they had built inside themselves. That's the transition. From performing because you have to performing because it's who you are. You're close to that." He paused. "You're building an identity, not a routine. Those are different things." He said goodbye simply and without ceremony, the way I had come to expect from him, and he walked to his car with the slight favoring of his right side. And that was the last time I saw him in person. 6 weeks later, I was promoted to lieutenant colonel. I opened the box that evening. Inside was a challenge coin. Not military issue, something older, clearly custom, the kind of thing that gets made within a specific unit for specific people at specific moments. On one side, there was no insignia, just a phrase in small, clean letters. On the other side, a name and a date I didn't recognize. I held it for a long time. I called a friend who was a few years senior to me, a colonel who had spent time in the special operations community earlier in his career. I described the coin without describing it too specifically, just the general design, the feel of it, the quality of the craft. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Where did you get that?" "A man named Raymond Cole gave it to me," I said. There was a pause that lasted long enough that I looked at my phone to see if the call had dropped. "Elena," he said, and his voice had changed register in a way that I had never heard from him before. Raymond Cole was. That's not a name I expected to hear. He paused again. "Did you know who he was?" "No," I said. "He was Delta," he said. "Not just Delta. He was Elena. There are people in that community whose names you hear and the room gets quiet. He was one of those people. He's been retired for about 5 years. He lives quietly. He doesn't do this. He doesn't mentor people. He doesn't..." Another pause. "Whatever he taught you, I want you to understand that it came from somewhere that very few people ever get access to." I sat in my kitchen holding the coin and looking at it for a long time after we hung up. I thought about the coffee shop and the quiet laugh and the voice that had said, without drama, without announcement, simply and directly, "Willpower is the reason you're failing." I thought about the track and the mornings and the specific quality of his attention. The way he listened, like someone who had spent a career in environments where listening incorrectly could cost everything, and had brought that same precision to bear on the problem of a tired major in a coffee shop who was talking to herself. I thought about what he had actually given me. Not motivation, not a feeling, a structure, a way of thinking about discipline, not as a thing you generate through force, but as a thing you build through decision, in advance, with intention, for a specific purpose, in service of something real. My son turned 9 2 months after I was promoted. He ran to me when I came through the door that evening, which was something he hadn't done in over a year. I held him for a long time and said nothing. I still have the coin. I carry it. And every morning when I wake up, whether I feel like it or not, whether the day ahead looks manageable or impossible, whether I'm motivated or empty, I don't ask myself how I feel about what comes next. The question is closed. The structure runs, not because Raymond Cole told me to, because I decided to. And the decision doesn't renegotiate based on the weather. That, I have come to understand, is the only secret. It was never about more willpower. It was about building something strong enough that willpower never had to be the answer. It was about becoming someone who doesn't need to fight herself to do what she already decided to do. I think about what it meant that Raymond Cole, a man who had spent his career inside the most classified, most demanding, most consequential operational work available to a human being in uniform, had chosen to spend a handful of Saturday mornings walking around a park track with a tired major who was talking to herself in a coffee shop. I think about what it says about knowledge and about the responsibility that comes with having it. The knowledge he carried did not accumulate itself. It came from decades of pressure and failure and adaptation, and the particular kind of clarity that only comes from being in situations where clarity is not optional. And he gave it away, quietly, without ceremony, to someone who stepped up without being asked. I have thought about that often in the years since, about what we do with what we know, about the people who taught us, whether they announced themselves as teachers or simply showed up in a coffee shop and asked a question that changed the direction of everything, about the responsibility that comes with having been on the receiving end of that kind of generosity. I've told this story to other women in uniform who are carrying more than anyone on the outside can see. I've told it to officers who are brilliant and exhausted, and who keep telling themselves, the same way I did, that the answer is more willpower, more force, more grip. I tell them what Raymond told me, in slightly different words, but with the same intention. Stop treating discipline like a feeling you generate. Start treating it like a structure you build. Build it when you're strong. Let it carry you when you're not. Decide, in advance, close the negotiation, and then live inside what you decided. Not because it's easy, because it works. Because the operators who lasted the longest and performed at the highest levels across decades of pressure did not do it by being harder than everyone else. They did it by being smarter about where they put the effort, not in forcing, in building, not in gripping, in designing, not in willpower, which runs out, in systems, which don't. And that, more than any promotion, more than any evaluation, more than any of the external markers that I had spent 12 years believing were the measure of what I was worth. That is the thing that changed my life. If you're listening to this and you're white-knuckling something, your career, your relationships, the version of yourself you keep promising, you'll become when you have more energy, more time, more motivation. I want to tell you what Raymond Cole told me in a coffee shop on a morning when I had already given up on myself. Willpower runs out. It was never meant to carry everything. Stop waiting to feel ready. Build the structure. Run the structure. Let the feeling catch up. Stop fighting yourself. Build something worth trusting, and then trust it. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to this channel. There are more people out there who found their way through, and their stories are worth your time. And if you're in the middle of your own version of this right now, leave a comment. You'd be surprised how many people are reading the same sentence you just read and feeling exactly what you're feeling, None of this happens alone.